Hello. Today I want us to look at Psalm 121. Let me begin by reading it. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. If you look through the Psalms, you'll see that several of them have titles. Titles were not part of the original Psalms, but they were added quite early. And they sometimes tell us a little bit about the Psalms. Maybe about the Psalm's background, or who it was written by, or who it was written for, or about. Sometimes there's information for musicians, what instruments to play, what tune. Psalm 121 is one of a series of psalms described as a song of ascents. It's a series that runs from Psalm 120 through to Psalm 134. Songs of ascents were probably sung by pilgrims on their way to the temple in Jerusalem, and in particular as they made their way in joyful procession up the Temple Mount and into the sanctuary. But in the midst of their celebrations, despite the joy of the occasion, despite the praise, despite the sense of God's presence there in the temple, or maybe even because of it, they had a question, which we see in the first verse of this psalm: where does my help come from? Of course, these days our circumstances are very different. We can't join together in celebration. We can't worship together. But the question is still an important one. And as we think about this psalm, I want to mention two things. First of all, the psalmist's concern. Where does my help come from? Now, worshipping together has real value, though at the moment we're having to find other ways of staying in contact. I'm not sure there are psalms for preparing to get together on WhatsApp. But for these pilgrims, whilst worshipping God was vitally important, and indeed it was the reason for their journey, they couldn't stay in that place of refuge forever. And this verse appears to picture them looking out at the world that they are part of, and the world that they will need to go back to. As I say, our situation is different. Even so, wherever we are, we can find ways of worshipping, whether it's through listening to sermons like this, or to streamed services, or to hymns and songs. And whilst coming together is important, we can know God's presence anywhere. And even while socially distancing and maybe in isolation, we do also remain part of this world. And as we look around at the world and we see its need, maybe we have those same concerns. When we're lost in worship, when we're enjoying being in God's presence, we can lose sight of other things. But when we find ourselves back in the midst of the difficulties and trials of life, and we certainly know something about that at the moment, we can ask the same question: where does my help come from? Where do I turn when things are difficult? Who or what do I look to help to see me through? And in these days when it's not easy to receive the direct physical support of other people, maybe that question becomes even more important. Let's look at the beginning of the psalm. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Some might be more familiar with the slightly different reading, I lift up my eyes to the hills, but the meaning is the same. Now that can be interpreted in different ways. First of all, mountains and hills were often thought of as places of refuge. When Saul became jealous of David and David had to run away, he headed to the hills. They were a place of security, a place of safety. The writer could here be looking at the hills and mountains as possible places of refuge from the storms of life. And that is always a temptation. Let's get away from it all. Let's go to where the things that worry us now can't touch us. That is a temptation for many. And some might try to justify it from a spiritual point of view. In one sense, these pilgrims travelling to the temple are taking time out of the routine of their lives. heading for somewhere where they are separated from the storms of life. And that has its place. Sometimes we need a break. We need, as another psalm says, to be still and know that I am God. And maybe the current crisis is giving us more time than we had before to spend time with God, to be quiet and still in his presence. But we spend time in God's presence only so that we can be renewed and given strength to come back to face the realities of life, because he wants to be there with us in that too. In the end, hiding away is not an option. The psalmist may be taking a short time out. When he says, I lift my eyes to the mountains, he may be tempted with the prospect of running away from his problems. But that's not really a solution. And this isn't just about him or us, because you see, God has a part for us to play in the world. He has a purpose that he is calling us to fulfill. And we need to be in the world to do that. We can't fulfill that purpose if we're hiding away. But then secondly, mountains and hills were also places where false gods were worshipped. In Greek and Roman mythology, the gods lived on Mount Olympus. And among the nations that surrounded Israel, gods were also thought to live on mountains. And in general, mountains and hills were chosen as places of worship because they were thought to be closer to the gods. Altars to gods were set up on what became known as high places. The existence of these high places was a constant thorn in the side of true worship in Israel and Judah. So when the psalmist says, I lift my eyes to the mountains, he may be thinking about the possible help that other gods and other things that he might be tempted to put his trust in might be able to offer him. The question is, can these gods help? For people today, we might be tempted to turn to things like money, to possessions, to prestige, to pleasure. These things may make us feel better for a short time. The book of Hebrews says that Moses chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. It doesn't deny that these other things can give some pleasure. They might make us feel better for a while. But their effect is fleeting. It doesn't last. And so false gods and false worship and its modern equivalents are also dismissed as an option. It may be tempting to trust other things, but that is not where real help and real security is to be found. So we see the temptation to run or hide away, the temptation to put our trust in false gods and other sources of help. But there's something else here too. Mountains and hills were also a source of danger. Mountains were a place of refuge, as I've said, and the psalmist might try to hide from his problems there. But by the same token, they were also places of refuge for outlaws, for bandits, and for robbers, and that made it very dangerous for those who had to pass that way. Remember the story Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. It began with a man travelling from Jerusalem to Jericho, who was set upon by robbers and left half dead. And what we may have here is the cry of a pilgrim who has travelled to Jerusalem, who has joined in worship and celebration, but who now looks out on the world that he'll have to go back and face. And he is aware especially of the hills around Jerusalem through which his journey lies, hills that may be filled with danger and menace. And in the face of that, in the face of the problems that come from living in the world, the difficulties, the dangers, the sadness, and all of the other things that are part of everyday life, he asks, where does my help come from? In the face of all that the world is throwing at me, who is with me? Who will help me? Who will give me strength? Who will guide my steps? Who will keep me safe? When I look at the dangers and difficulties of the path I am called upon to walk, with all of the other things that might tempt me to take an easier path, where does my help come from? And that is a real question being asked by millions of people every day. And so we turn to the second point, the psalmist's confidence. My help, he goes on to say, comes from the Lord. As he lifts his eyes to the mountains, his mind maybe prompted by his worship or by the sense of anticipation, rises even higher. It leaps beyond the hills, beyond the mountains, to the universe, and indeed beyond the universe, to its creator. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Now, as we saw last week, talking about God as creator emphasizes his power. He called everything into existence with just a word. And with a word, he transforms chaos into something ordered, useful, and good. When the people of God were in exile, this was something they held on to. God was the creator. No one and nothing was like him. The gods of other nations were mere idols, pieces of wood they couldn't help. But nor could they prevent their God from fulfilling his purposes to save, renew, and restore them. The nations too were no help. Here are some verses from Isaiah 40. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. And the passage goes on. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. The gods of the nations themselves are of no use. So far as the people of Israel were concerned, the gods of the nations were idols. Now, they were associated with mountains, as we've said. And of course, that's also true of Israel's God. He appeared on Mount Sinai during the Exodus. And here the psalmist is, along with others, going up the hill on which the temple was built. And there might have been times when he thought that that hill, the hill where the temple stood, was small by comparison with some of the other mountains. Did that mean that his God was smaller than the gods of the nations? By no means. God is the creator. They are worthless idols. Psalm 96:5. All the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. God, as creator, sets him apart from all of the other gods. And in the future, we're told, the hill on which the temple stood will be raised far above all other mountains. In that coming day, God will be seen by the whole world for who he really is. The one true God, the only one who can help. He is the Lord of all. In the meantime, his people know and acknowledge him. And that makes a difference. Why do we need to hide away from the world when we know that it belongs to God, that he is committed to it, and he has a part for us to play in it? Why would we put trust in the things of this world when we can trust the one who made the world and holds everything in his hands? Why would we fear the dangers of this world or become anxious about life in this world when we are assured of protection by its creator and we can put our hand into his and know his loving fatherly care? Coming back to Psalm 121, the remaining verses go on to say more about this God. A common thread running right through the psalm is of God watching over his people. Now let me stress, this is not a big brother kind of watching. The word is used in the sense of to guard or to keep, and here has the sense of looking after, taking care of, guarding, guiding, protecting. God cares for us. Now maybe we recognize his power, but we're not sure of his care and of his love. Maybe we need to be reminded of that. But if ever we're tempted to question the love of God, we just need to look at the cross and see how far he was willing to go for us. God gave up his son. Jesus gave up his life and all of it for us, for you and for me. Now, in these verses, God's watchful care is clearly an important theme. It appears on no fewer than 6 occasions in this psalm. Verse 3, he watches over you. You there is singular. God knows and cares about individuals. Each one of us is under his watchful, guarding, keeping care. And then in verse 4, that is extended to the nation, to the community. He watches over us. He may be the creator, the maker of heaven and earth, and we may feel small compared with the vastness of all that is around us. But God knows about us. Nothing that affects our lives escapes his watchful eye. As Jesus reminds us, the very hairs on our head are numbered. He knows every detail of our lives. And what that means is he will not let your foot slip. This is the picture of being guided along an unfamiliar road where there is a great danger of stumbling or falling. We may be called to walk paths that are unfamiliar, paths that are difficult, but we have one beside us who knows the way and who walks with us, keeping us on the right road, guarding us from pitfalls and from danger. And just to pick up on some of the other things we see here, in his watchful care, God does not take time off. He does not slumber or sleep. Other gods were thought to have times when they did go to sleep, when things happened without them knowing. When Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to see whose God would set fire to the sacrifice that they had each prepared on the altar, however much those false prophets prayed to their gods, nothing happened. And we read that Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. But that is not true of our God. He remains awake. He remains alert. He is always there for us, and nothing takes him by surprise. He is with us every step of the way. He guards us from the known and the unknown threats of day and night. What we can see, what we can't see. God sees it all, and he keeps us safe through it. And just to emphasize his presence, he is described as the shade at our right hand. He is right there beside us. Going back to the first verse of the psalm, the distant mountains and hills may be a source of potential danger. But God and his guidance and the protection that he offers, these things are not far away. He is there at our right hand. And what is true of the immediate problem is also true for the whole of the believer's life. He watches over all of our lives, and he will keep us from all harm. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that believers will have an easy, cushioned life. We know that very well. He does not cushion us from harm or evil, but he does keep us protected from its effects. We see that in Psalm 23. Verse 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. We may still have to walk through those dark valleys. We're not protected from that, but we can face them and we can walk through them because he is with us. Christians can expect to face sadness, heartache, misfortune. We live in a fallen world, and these things are part of that world. We may be called to walk a difficult, perhaps even a dangerous path. But through it all, we have one who cares for us, one who watches over us, one who helps us through. And the pledge that God gives at the end of this passage could hardly be stronger or more sweeping. He talks about your coming and your going. That's another way of saying all the time, through every circumstance of life, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whatever we're going through, whatever challenges and difficulties we may face, through it all, we can know God's guidance, protection, and blessing. He is with us throughout our lives. He will watch over us and keep us through this life and bring us one day safe into the glory that Jesus' death and resurrection have won for us. That's why we don't need to be afraid. That's why we don't need to look anywhere else. That's why we don't need to hide away. Where does my help come from? In the midst of all the storms and the problems of this life, on a path beset with pitfalls and dangers, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Amen.